There are some stories we consume, and then there are stories that consume us back. Silent Hill is one of those stories. Not because it's loud, not because it's flashy, and not because it tells you everything you need to know. In fact, it does the opposite. Silent Hill withholds, it obscures, it waits. It asks you to walk into the fog without knowing what's on the other side, and more importantly, it asks if you're ready for what might be hiding inside you when you get there. This isn't a game about jump scares or gore. This is a story about grief, about guilt, about the past that doesn't stay buried. It's about what happens when trauma puts on flesh and whispers to you in the dark. And as a writer, that kind of storytelling fascinates me. Because Silent Hill 1, for all its graphical limitations and PlayStation era quirks, doesn't just tell a horror story, it invites you to live inside one. I've been telling stories for years, some with monsters, some with heartbreak, usually a little bit of both. But what I've learned, what Silent Hill reminds me, is that the most powerful horror doesn't come from what you see. It comes from what you suspect, what you can't explain, what you feel in your bones but can't articulate in words. That's what this town does. It doesn't attack you, it studies you. It shows you who you are and asks you to walk deeper anyway. When I first played Silent Hill 1, I wasn't old enough to understand everything I was seeing. I didn't know what symbolic horror was, I didn't recognize religious trauma. I just knew the game made me feel wrong, unsettled in a way I couldn't shake. Now, years later, as an author, I understand why. Because this game doesn't operate like traditional narrative. It's dream logic. It's emotional architecture. It's trauma turned into terrain. And that's what makes it brilliant. There's a tendency to dismiss early video game stories as primitive, as if they were just placeholders for gameplay. But that would be a mistake with Silent Hill, because this story doesn't just use horror tropes, it writes with them. It uses absence like a sentence, silence like punctuation, static like foreshadowing. Every piece of it, the fog, the camera angles, the stilted voice acting, contributes to a very specific feeling. You're not supposed to be here. Something is wrong. But you don't get to know what. Not yet. As a writer, I see this as intentional design. Not a flaw, not an accident, but purpose. The town isn't a setting, it's a character, and that character doesn't speak with words, it speaks with shadows. This video isn't a review. It's not about mechanics or combat or whether puzzles make sense. This is about story, about theme, about the psychological gravity of a place that reminds you of your sins even when you've forgotten them. It's about Harry Mason, a father, not a warrior, and the terrifying helplessness of searching for a child in a world that feels like it knows more than you do. It's about Cheryl and Alessa, and the idea that identity is not just fragile, it's sometimes fragmented beyond repair. It's about Lisa, and how horror can break your heart, not just your spirit. And above all, it's about the fog, the metaphor that wraps around every character, every building, every memory. You don't get a map through trauma, you get fog, and every step forward means confronting something you buried on purpose. Even all these years later, Silent Hill 1 still feels timeless. Not because of its graphics, not because of its gameplay, but because fear, real fear, never goes out of style. And Silent Hill isn't interested in showing you monsters. It's interested in showing you why you might need them. Why our minds create demons. Why our memories twist. Why sometimes the most terrifying thing isn't what's in front of you. It's what you brought with you. As an author, this is the kind of story I return to again and again. Not for answers, but for questions. Because Silent Hill doesn't hand you a conclusion. It hands you a flashlight and tells you, go looking. This is Silent Hill. A story told in static, a town that waits for those who can't forget. And this is my breakdown, not as a critic, but as a writer. Some places are built to tell stories. They have roads and landmarks, and buildings that all push you in a certain direction. But Silent Hill doesn't do that. Silent Hill isn't a setting you explore. It's a character you confront. It watches you, it tests you, and if you pay attention, really pay attention, it doesn't just react to your choices, it writes back. Let's start with the obvious. Silent Hill is ugly. It's decaying, uninviting, the streets are cracked, signs half lit or flickering with unreasonable static. Even when it's bright, it feels dark. And then there's the fog. It rolls in like memory, not the good kind, the heavy kind. The kind that settles in your lungs and makes it hard to move. The fog isn't just there to hide PlayStation rendering limits, it's there to isolate you. You can't see where you're going. You can't tell how far you've come. You can't trust what's real. And from a writing perspective, that's genius. Because the fog acts as narrative friction. It slows you down. It forces you to listen. It makes every single step uncertain. And in a story about emotional disorientation, that's exactly what you need. As writers, we're often taught that settings should reflect theme. In Silent Hill, the town does more than reflect the story. It is the story. Every building, every alley, every transition from the waking world to the other world is a psychological metaphor. The school, innocence corrupted. The hospital, the fragility of the body, the lies we tell ourselves about healing. The church, the twisting of faith. The amusement park, childhood joy wrapped into something feral. You're not moving through locations. You're moving through layers of trauma. Most of them not even your own. And that's what makes the town so disorientating. Because the rules of logic don't apply here. This isn't a world designed for navigation. It's designed for confrontation. The locked doors, the looping past, the nonsensical keys. They're not there to frustrate you. They're there to trap you in someone else's memory. And until you understand that memory, or at least accept it, you won't get out. And then there's the sound design, or maybe the lack of it. Because Silent Hill isn't filled with music. It's filled with absence. Footsteps, static, the distant clank of something metal dragging across concrete. That radio, the one that hisses whenever something inhuman is nearby, becomes your heartbeat. It's the closest thing you get to a narrator. Not one that tells you what's happening, but one that warns you something will. As a writer, I'm fascinated by this approach, because most games and many stories are afraid of silence. They fill the gaps with exposition, or noise, or spectacle. But Silent Hill leans into the gaps, and makes you sit in them, and then it fills those spaces with unease, not by telling you something is wrong, but by letting you feel it before you can explain it. That's not just sound design, that's narrative craft. What I love about the town is that it doesn't obey its own map. You'll turn down a street that was open 2 hours ago and find it collapsed. You'll re-enter a building and discover it's changed, rusted over, decayed in ways that wasn't before. The very shape of the world shifts based on your proximity to truth. That's not level design. That's psychological terrain. It's the manifestation of a mind, or multiple minds, unraveling. And from a literary perspective, this is the equivalent of an unreliable narrator in physical form. You're not just playing as Harry Mason, you're walking through his interpretation of what's going on. You don't get a God's eye view, you get a broken mirror. And as you move deeper into town, and closer to the root of its rot, the mirror starts to crack in ways even you can't ignore. Here's what truly sets Silent Hill apart from other horror games in this era. It trusts the player to read between the lines. It doesn't explain everything. It doesn't rush to tell you who Alessa is or why the monsters look the way they do. It shows you in architecture, in atmosphere, in absence, and expects you to carry the weight of that ambiguity. That's bold writing, because ambiguity isn't lazy, it's difficult. It requires discipline. You have to know exactly what you're hiding, and trust that your audience will feel its shape even if they never see its face. And Silent Hill does that masterfully. It doesn't give you exposition. It gives you a rusted door and asks, do you really want to open this? In most horror games, the environment reacts to your actions. In Silent Hill, the environment reacts to your existence. Because this place doesn't become twisted after you arrive. It was already twisted. You were just the newest echo, the newest memory for the town to process, the newest guilt to make a manifestation. And that's the part most players never realize until it's too late. You're not saving the town. You're not escaping the town. You're feeding it. Every step you take, every question you ask, every door you open, it pulls you deeper, not just into the narrative, but into the wound. Because that's what Silent Hill is, a wound. And you don't leave a wound by closing it. You leave it by understanding what caused it. The town doesn't care if you survive. It only cares that you remember. In most horror stories, especially in games, we follow someone extraordinary. A soldier, a detective, a survivor forged by fire. But Silent Hill doesn't give us that. Instead, it gives us Harry Mason, a writer, a father, a man so ordinary at first glance, he seems like the last person you'd trust to survive a nightmare. And that's exactly what makes him perfect. Harry isn't a warrior. He doesn't have military training or combat experience. He's not even particularly brave. He's regular, soft-spoken, slightly awkward, often unsure. He reacts the way you might, not with confidence, but with confusion. And in a story like this, it's not a flaw. That's the point. Because the horror in Silent Hill isn't physical, it's emotional. And Harry, with his plainness, his vulnerability, becomes the perfect mirror for that kind of fear. Harry's journey begins not with revenge or glory, but with something heartbreakingly simple. His daughter's missing. That's it. That's all he knows. The car crashed, the road went silent, and Cheryl, the most important person in his world, is gone. And so he steps into the fog, not because he wants to be a hero, but because he's a father. As a writer, that choice is everything. Because when your protagonist isn't driven by ego or survival instinct, but by love, everything becomes more vulnerable. The stakes aren't abstract. They're achingly personal. He doesn't care about monsters or mysteries. He just wants to find his little girl. And the tragedy, the slow burning horror that creeps into the game, is that he might not be prepared for what finding her actually means. There's something almost untrained about the way Harry navigates Silent Hill. He holds a gun like he's afraid of it. His aim is completely unreliable. He often says the wrong thing in cutscenes or asks questions that go unanswered. In most games, that would feel like bad writing. But here, it's brilliant. Because Harry's not a protagonist in control. He's a man barely holding it together. He's navigating not just a town, but a collapse of reality. And he's doing it without the tools we usually give our heroes. No bravado, no kill count, no clarity, just fear and desperation. And love that refuses to let go, even when it probably should. That's a rare thing in games. And as a writer, I admire the restraint of it. Because writing a weak character well is harder than writing a strong one. It means letting the audience feel uncomfortable, letting the protagonist fail, letting them be human. And that's exactly what Harry is. In many ways, Harry isn't just the story's hero. He's its lens. He asks what we would ask. He panics when we would panic. He gets turned around and confused because, well, we do too. And in doing that, he becomes invisible in the best way possible. He doesn't dominate the story, he dissolves into it. We're not watching him overcome Silent Hill. We're watching him get absorbed by it. And the more time we spend with him, the more we realize this isn't a story about conquering horror. It's about enduring it. Surviving long enough to understand that the pain isn't going away. But maybe you can carry it without it swallowing you whole. And that's what Harry teaches us. Not how to win, but how to keep walking. how to keep moving forward, even when the road turns into nightmare, even when you're alone, even when the voice calling for you in the fog might not be your daughter at all. The emotional heart of Silent Hill isn't the cult. It's not the monsters. It's the slow, dawning realization that Harry might not be able to save Cheryl. That maybe she's not even Cheryl anymore. That maybe she never was. That maybe, and this is the real knife twist, he doesn't even know what she is. And yet he keeps going. He searches the school. He searches the hospital. He dives deeper into a town that's wrapping around him like a broken memory. And at every turn, he's met with more questions, more absence, more fog. That persistence, that refusal to stop, is what defines him. He doesn't understand what's happening. He doesn't know who to trust. He has no guarantee he'll ever make it out alive. But still he searches. That's not bravery. That's grief with a flashlight. And that's what makes him unforgettable. So as storytellers, what do we learn from Harry Mason? We learn that sometimes the strongest protagonist isn't the one with the answers. It's the one who asks anyway. We learn that emotional stakes are enough, that saving the world is less compelling than saving one person you love. We learn that horror is more intimate when the protagonist isn't trying to solve it, but just survive it. Harry doesn't change the town. He doesn't defeat it, but he faces it. And when you're walking through a story built on guilt, fear, and loss, that's the only kind of hero you need. A man who doesn't run away, even when every instinct tells him to. He's a fighter. He's a survivor. He's a father. And that's enough. In every story, there's a center, a character, a moment, a memory that everything else spirals around, like a drain. In Silent Hill 1, that center isn't Harry. It isn't the town. It's a girl. Or rather, two girls. Cheryl and Alessa. Two names, two lives. Two halves of the same tragedy. And as a writer, I can't help but see this as the emotional and thematic heart of the game. Not just a twist, but a metaphor so deep and raw, it becomes the soil every other part of the story is planted in. From the very beginning, Harry is searching for Cheryl, his adopted daughter. We're told little about her. She's quiet, kind, small, seems like any other little girl until she vanishes into the fog. But Cheryl, we learn, isn't what she seems. Because she's not whole. She's fragmented. A piece of a child named Alessa Gillespie. A child who was sacrificed by her mother in a cult ritual and then burned alive. But the fire didn't kill her, not physically, but it split her. And in that split, Cheryl was born, an innocent piece of Alessa's soul cast away, sent into the world to live a different life, a better one. A second chance. As a writer, that is an incredibly powerful device, because it reframes Cheryl not as a missing child, but as a lost innocence. A purity severed from trauma, the part of a person that tries to move forward while another part stays trapped in the fire. While Cheryl lives a quiet, peaceful life with Harry, Alessa stays behind, not by choice, by force. Her body survives, but her soul is shattered. She's used, worshipped, tortured. A prisoner in her own pain, exploited by the town's cult, and more specifically by her mother, Dahlia. Dahlia doesn't see a daughter. She sees a vessel, a tool for birthing the town's twisted god. And that's where horror steps beyond monsters, into something spiritual, psychological. Because Alessa is no longer a girl. She's a wound that never closed. She exists in this liminal space between child and myth, between victim and source, and the town itself bends around her pain. And Cheryl? She's a piece of Alessa that escaped. What Silent Hill does so well, and what most horror games don't even attempt, is take this metaphysical split and use it as a narrative tool for emotional storytelling. This isn't just a plot twist. It's a portrait of trauma response. Alessa is the part that remembers. Cheryl is the part that forgets. One screams in the fire, the other lives in peace. But the longer they remain apart, the more disoriented their worlds become. That's why Silent Hill is the way it is. Not because of evil, not because of a curse. Because a little girl was broken, and the pieces couldn't survive on their own. As a writer, I can't think of a more intimate form of horror. This is identity horror. The fear that we are not who we think we are. That the self is just a collection of fragile compartments, and if one breaks, the rest collapses. There's something especially haunting about the idea that the same soul can produce both serenity and suffering. That Cheryl, sweet, quiet Cheryl, is literally made from the part of Alessa that longed to be loved. And Alessa, bent, furious, shrouded in pain, is what was left behind. They are not good and evil. They are not opposites. They are incomplete. And so the town and the story pulls them back together. Not because it wants to heal them, but because it needs to. Because something fractured that deeply simply can't exist forever. And neither can the world around it. So Cheryl is called back, not by a villain, not by a kidnapper, but by destiny, by gravity, by the weight of a soul trying to become whole again. Now let's talk about what this means for Harry, because up until this point, he believes he's searching for his daughter. But now he learns he's been searching for someone else's pain, someone else's failure, someone else's grief. He was handed a child, raised her as his own, loved her without reservation, and now discovers that she's part of something older, deeper, and darker than he ever imagined. And what does he do? He keeps going. He doesn't reject Cheryl when he learns she's Alessa. He doesn't question her soul. He doesn't turn his back. Because for Harry, love isn't conditional. It isn't logical. It isn't based on origin. It's based on presence. She called him daddy. That's all he needs. And that's where the story punches you right in the heart. Because in a world of shifting faces, unreliable realities, and fractured identities, Harry chooses love. Even if it means losing her again. Even if it means walking away from the only piece of her he'll ever get back. This is where Silent Hill 1 transcends horror and becomes something closer to tragedy. Because when we write characters like Cheryl and Alessa, we're not just writing people. We're writing wounds. And wounds don't speak in clear arcs. They fester. They echo. They split. The story doesn't ask, will Harry survive? It asks, can a soul survive being broken in half? Can innocence and trauma coexist? Or must they, in the end, reunite, even if it means death? That's the kind of storytelling that stays with you, that ages so well, that cuts deeper the more you live, and the more you realize what you've tried to leave behind may still be walking somewhere in the fog. This is not just horror. It's heartache made supernatural. A soul in pieces, a child divided, and a father who never stops loving either half. Some of the most powerful writing happens in the spaces between words, the silence between footsteps, the fog between street lamps, the breath held a little too long in the dark. Silent Hill 1 isn't loud about its horror. It whispers. It implies. And somehow that makes it scream louder than any chainsaw ever could. This chapter isn't about plot. It's about presence, and how the game wraps fear around you without ever having to explain to you why you're afraid. Most horror games give you monsters with clear origins. This is the infected or the cursed. This one was created in a lab. But in Silent Hill, the monsters don't come with instruction manuals. They come with shapes. Half-formed, skinless, twisted things. Ambiguous limbs, faceless heads, movements that are just wrong. You don't understand what they are, and that's exactly why they scare you. Because they feel like something your mind almost remembers. They feel like nightmares you've half forgotten. Things you've dreamed about when you were sick or sad or alone in the hospital waiting room. They don't represent enemies. They represent feelings. And in horror, real horror, that's far more dangerous. Every monster in Silent Hill is a metaphor. You just might not recognize it the right way. Take the gray children in the school. Small, twitchy figures with knives, barely visible in the fog. On the surface, they're enemies. But under the surface, they're shadows of trauma. They represent Alessa's past, the fears she felt being bullied, the violence that twisted into her perception of what children even were. Or the straight-jacketed monsters, with arms bound around their torsos, mouths where their chests should be. They aren't just creepy, they're trapped fear. Suffocation made with flesh. This is writing without dialogue. This is emotional storytelling through visual metaphor. And it's more powerful than a cutscene could ever be, because the game doesn't just tell you what the monsters mean. It trusts that you'll feel it, that your gut will recognize the language, even if your brain cannot translate it. Now let's talk about silence, one of the game's most terrifying tools. In most games, silence means nothing is happening. It's the space between action. But in Silent Hill, silence is weight. It's not about absence. It's pressure. The kind that builds in your ears. The kind that makes your shoulders rise without realizing it. The kind that feels like it's waiting for you to make the next mistake. Sometimes you'll walk entire corridors with no music. No sound except for your own feet. A flickering light. The soft whine of your radio, static building like breath just before a scream. As a writer, this is what I admire most, the restraint, the refusal to fill every moment, the discipline to let fear sit, because horror isn't just what you see, it's about what you anticipate. And when you strip away exposition, when you leave out sound, when you remove the crutches of clarity, then you give the audience one thing: their own imagination. And that's where the true monsters live. Silent Hill doesn't just contain horror, it is horror. The walls themselves pulse. The pipes leak something too dark to be water. Even when you're alone, you feel watched. And none of it's explained. You don't get lore dumps about why the town's rusted over. You don't get detailed backstories for every strange symbol or bloodstain. You just move through it. Your experience in the way trauma is experienced. Confusing, overwhelming, impossible to make sense of in the moment. And that's the brilliance of the design, both in art and in writing. Because the town doesn't follow natural laws. It follows emotional logic. Where fear intensifies, so does disorientation. Where memory hurts, the world bleeds. You're not in a haunted town. You're inside a story someone is still trying to forget. What Silent Hill teaches us, especially as writers, is you don't have to explain everything. In fact, sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that don't. Ambiguity is the lack of clarity. It's a tool. When used well, it doesn't confuse the reader. It engages them. It turns them into a participant, someone who fills in the gaps, someone who invests emotionally, because they're trying to understand what's not being said. This is literary horror. It's Shirley Jackson. It's early Stephen King. It's psychological dread instead of gore. It's the space between words, the one where your own fears live. Silent Hill doesn't hand you meaning, it hands you a flashlight and a question. What do you think is happening? And that's the scariest of all, because when horror asks you to provide the answer, you realize you might not like what comes out. So what can we learn from all this? We learn that horror isn't built on volume. It's built on vulnerability. That sometimes what you don't show tells the truer story. That leaving the monster unnamed gives it more power. That setting a story into silence gives the reader a chance to hear themselves. We learn that writing can make use of atmosphere, not just as setting, but as emotional gravity. Everything in Silent Hill 1 is heavy, not because it's loud, not because it's fast, but because it hurts. Because it mirrors something real, an ache, a fear, a guilt that doesn't go away. The kind that lingers long after the screen fades to black. This is how horror speaks when it's writing to the soul. Through silence, through suggestion, through shapes you don't recognize until you're already inside of them. There's a specific kind of horror that doesn't wear claws or teeth. It wears a cross. It speaks in whispers. It hides in stained glass and ancient symbols. And in Silent Hill, it rots beneath the surface. This isn't just a game about monsters or grief. It's a game about belief and what happens when faith is twisted into something that consumes the very thing it was meant to protect. The Order, the cult at the heart of Silent Hill, isn't your typical video game villain faction. They're not cartoonish. They're not edgy caricatures. They're not here to take over the world. They're trying to reshape it in their image. Through pain, through sacrifice. Their goal is to birth a god. Not to conquer, but to cleanse. And that alone tells you everything. Because this isn't about power. It's about righteousness. At the center of the faith is one woman, Dahlia Gillespie, Alessa's mother, religious fanatic, worshipper of flame and fate. She isn't loud, she isn't theatrical, she's calm. And that's what makes her terrifying. Because Dahlia believes every word she says. She believes in the God. She believes in the fire. She believes her daughter, her own flesh and blood, is a vessel for divinity. So she sacrifices her, burns her alive, and calls it faith. As a writer, Dahlia is horrifying not because she's evil, but because she's so certain. And certainty is where true horror often begins. The scariest part of the story isn't the cult's rituals, it's their logic. They see the suffering as sacred. They see trauma as transformation. They believe pain is a necessary part of purification. That's what they do to Alessa. That's why the town's cursed. That's why everything feels like it's been scrubbed raw and left to fester. Because somewhere, deeper in the town's roots, a child was burned, and the people who lit the match believed they were doing something holy. That's not just horror. That's fanaticism. That's a kind of belief that doesn't break when faced with evidence or empathy. It thrives on them. The more the world resists, the stronger it grows. And the town, in its twisted silence, remembers every word. Silent Hill is filled with religious iconography, but it's never just for decoration. The churches aren't safe havens, they're staging grounds. The altars don't offer hope, they demand obedience. You see murals of gods you don't recognize, hear sermons that sound like they've been translated through smoke and blood. The game borrows from Christianity, yes, but also from occultism, mysticism, and Eastern theology. It becomes a mosaic of belief systems melted together like stained glass in a fire. And that fire is Alessa, because her suffering isn't just backstory, it's ritual. It's the foundation upon which the cult built its myth. They turned a little girl's pain into scripture. And that, from a writer's perspective, is where horror becomes sacrilege. In most games, evil is something you can shoot. But in Silent Hill, evil is something you believe, or worse, something you were taught. The town isn't infected with the virus. It's infected with doctrine, a way of thinking, a way of seeing pain as proof of progress, a way of convincing yourself that the more the world burns, the closer you are to being saved. And that's how the cult survives, not just through members, but through ideas. You don't have to be a robed follower to spread their gospel. You just have to believe that pain means something. And in Silent Hill, everyone believes that on some level. Even Harry. Even you. What makes this so effective, so literary, is that it forces us as storytellers and players to question the stories we're told. How many of us have been handed a belief we didn't choose? How many of us have been told that suffering is necessary, that love means sacrifice, that devotion means silence? The cult in Silent Hill is terrifying because it's familiar. It's not some alien, unknowable force. It's a warped version of our own institutions, our own families, our own fears. And that's the kind of horror that lingers. The kind that doesn't just show you a monster. It shows you what happens when a lie becomes law. Alessa didn't just suffer. She suffered for belief. She became a myth, a prophecy. She became the thing her mother prayed for, not because she wanted to, but because she was made into it. And Cheryl? She was the piece of Alessa that escaped the story. The part that isn't indoctrinated, the part that had a chance to live free. But the town, and the cult's ideology, couldn't let that happen, because belief, once fractured, will always try to repair itself, even if it has to burn everything again to do it. As authors, this is where we pay attention, because belief systems, when used well in fiction, are never just background. They're motives, they're characters of their own. They are villains in disguise. The Order doesn't need to raise an army. They already raised a god and a little girl, and then asked the world to bow. That's not science fiction, that's storytelling. That's what happens when someone else's idea of salvation becomes your prison. And in Silent Hill, there are no saviors, only survivors, only witnesses, only the smell of smoke in your clothes long after the fire has gone out. This is not just a cult. It's a story you weren't meant to survive. And in the end, the question isn't whether the god comes. It's whether the town ever stopped worshipping pain to begin with. There are characters who help tell a story, and there are characters who become the story you never forget. In Silent Hill, no one embodies that more than Lisa Garland. She isn't a monster. She isn't a cultist. She isn't even a major antagonist. She's just a nurse. A young woman in the wrong place at the wrong time. And that's exactly what makes her unforgettable. Because Lisa represents something deeper than horror. She represents the part of the story that still bleeds. On paper, Lisa is simple. She's a nurse who cared for Alessa after the fire. She worked in the Alchemilia hospital. She wasn't part of the cult, at least not willingly. She was there to help. But help became complicity. Because the longer she stayed in Silent Hill, the less she could leave. And the longer she looked after Alessa, the more she realized she wasn't just providing care. She was trapping a child in her own pain. And she couldn't stop. Not because she didn't want to, but because something about Silent Hill wouldn't let her. We learned that Lisa struggled with addiction. That she was dependent on drugs administered or withheld by hospital staff connected to the cult. She wasn't just a nurse, she was a pawn. And from a writing perspective, that matters. Because Lisa isn't evil. She's just human. Deeply, devastatingly human. She wanted to help. She wanted to be better. But she was trapped in a system that fed on her weakness. A system that used her innocence to contain someone else's trauma. And the guilt of that, the knowledge that she was part of something horrific, is what finally breaks her. Lisa isn't scary when you first meet her. She's lost, confused. She clings to Harry like a lifeline. She wants answers. She wants clarity. But the closer you get to her, the more wrong she begins to feel. There's a scene, short, brutal, unforgettable, where she begins to remember what she really is. She starts to cry, then scream, and then bleed. Not from a wound, but from everywhere. Blood pours from her eyes, her skin, her clothes, as if the very act of remembering is tearing her apart. Then she says, "Why? Why can't I remember anything? I'm not dead, am I?" It's not a scare, it's a breakdown. And it's one of the most tragic moments in the game. Because Lisa, in that moment, isn't afraid of dying. She's afraid of realizing she already did. Lisa's a ghost. Not in the Hollywood sense, in the emotional one. She's the embodiment of denial, a soul caught between roles. A person who died with so much guilt unresolved, she couldn't let herself fade. And the town, in its cruel brilliance, kept her around. Because she belongs in Silent Hill. She is Silent Hill. A good person who became part of something evil and never forgave herself for it. She wanders the hallways. She clutches her clipboard. She repeats routines that no longer matter. Not because she wants to, but because she can't stop. Because the pain hasn't left her, so she hasn't left it. What's most devastating about Lisa's story isn't that she's a ghost. It's that you feel for her. She's not an obstacle or a boss. She is a victim of the very thing the town preys on, unresolved pain. And that's what elevates Silent Hill's writing. It doesn't just scare you with its ghost, it makes you grieve them. Lisa didn't deserve what happened to her, but she believed she did. And in this world, belief is reality. So she remains, a symbol of what happens when a person can't let go of what they've done, or what they were forced to do. From a storytelling perspective, Lisa is the counterpoint to so many horror tropes. She's not the final girl, she's not the screaming virgin, she's not even a vengeful spirit. She's something much harder to look at. She's the remnant, the leftovers, the quiet aftermath, the guilt left behind after the story ends. The soft voice asking, "Was I a bad person?" long after everyone else has stopped listening. And that's where horror becomes literary. Because Lisa isn't there to scare you. She's there to remind you that some people don't get closure. Some people never stop bleeding. And the town, the story, holds on to them. Because letting them go would mean admitting that forgiveness isn't always possible. And that is terrifying in its own way. So what do we learn from Lisa? We learn that horror doesn't have to be loud to be devastating. That a character doesn't need to dominate the plot to be unforgettable. We learn that sometimes the scariest thing in a story isn't the monster. It's the memory of someone who didn't make it out. Lisa teaches us about guilt, about vulnerability, about how easy it is to become part of something awful without realizing it, and how impossible it can be to forgive yourself afterwards. She teaches us that some ghosts don't wail, they whisper. She's not here to kill you. She's here to ask, if I was just trying to help, why am I still here? Most stories end with a sense of finality. The villain fails, the mystery unravels, the hero escapes the fire and walks into the light. But Silent Hill doesn't care about resolution. It cares about reverberation. What happens after the answers don't help? What happens when the truth is just as unbearable as the fear? Silent Hill 1 gives you those answers, and then dares you to live with them. Like many good games of its time, Silent Hill 1 has multiple endings. You can get the good ending, a bad plus ending, even a joke ending if you find the right items. But none of them are comfortable. None of them wrap the story in a neat little bow, because this isn't a game about saving the day. It's a game about surviving and unraveling reality. It's about whether you understand what you've been through, and whether you can walk away with your soul intact. In both the good and bad endings, Alessa dies. Not in rage, not in revenge, but in mercy. She gives Harry the baby, she gives Cheryl back. And maybe, forward. It's one of the most emotionally complex moments in the game. But Alessa, after all her pain, after years of being used, burned, fractured, doesn't lash out. She lets go. She gives the only pure part of herself a chance at peace. That isn't just narrative closure. That's emotional transcendence. A child who was used like a vessel becomes a mother of hope, even if it's a hope she'll never live to see. That's not victory, that's sacrifice, and it hurts, because it should. What makes these endings so powerful isn't what happened, it's what's left behind. No matter which version you get, you walk away with something broken. A realization, a weight, a scar. You've seen what belief can do. You've seen what love becomes under pressure. You've seen what a soul looks like when it's torn in half and forced to keep living. And now you have to carry that. That's the brilliance of Silent Hill 1. It's not concerned with plot mechanics. It's concerned with psychological residue. You don't beat the game, you outlast it. And when it's done, you're different. You're not just someone who played a horror story. You're someone who survived one. As a writer, this is where we listen carefully, because most stories we're taught to tell end with clarity, with explanation and balance. But Silent Hill teaches us that truth doesn't always heal. Sometimes it just confirms the pain was real, and that's enough, because horror isn't always about defeating the monster. Sometimes it's about realizing you were part of the story all along, and you didn't get out untouched. That's what makes these endings so brilliant. They're not about who wins. They're about what it costs to reach the end, and whether you can live with what you've learned. So what do we as storytellers learn here? We learn that ambiguity can be a gift, that not every arc has to close cleanly, that sometimes the best things you can do is leave a light on and let the reader decide what they saw. We learn that truth in storytelling doesn't always mean resolution. Sometimes it means grief. Sometimes it means quiet. Sometimes it means walking away with something you didn't want to know. And when a story ends like that, when it dares to break your heart instead of pat it dry, that's when it stays with you. That's when it becomes literature. This is the end, but not closure, because some stories don't end, they echo. And every time you think you've left Silent Hill, you hear the sirens again. If you've made it this far, through the fog, through the blood, through the silence that echoes more than screams ever could, then you already know. Silent Hill 1 is more than a horror game. It's a literary experience. It doesn't just scare, it haunts. And for those of us who write, who live in the space between worlds, always looking for how stories move not just the plot, but the soul, it's one of the most important pieces of interactive fiction can create. Because it teaches us how to write fear not as a reaction, but as a language. Most horror stories chase the scream, the loud moment, the flash of teeth, the blood on the wall. But Silent Hill chases the breath before the scream, the hesitation, the door you don't want to open, the hallway that keeps getting longer, the silence that stretches just a little too long to be natural. It doesn't rush you. It waits. It lets the fear crawl up from beneath. And that's the first lesson. Fear is most effective when it has time to settle. As writers, we can fill pages with monsters, but they won't matter unless we leave space for the reader to feel watched. We're often told to make things clear. What's the villain's motive? What's the timeline? Who did what, when, and why? But Silent Hill teaches us something else. That not everything has to be explained. That some parts of the story should remain in the fog. Because ambiguity doesn't confuse, it engages. It pulls the audience in. It makes them search, interpret, question. It gives them the role in building fear. As a writer, that's incredibly powerful. Because when a reader becomes an investigator, they become emotionally complicit in the story. And fear, once internalized, doesn't fade easily. The monsters in Silent Hill aren't just enemies, they're expressions of guilt or memory, of trauma never healed. Every twitch, every groan, every unnatural movement is a visual sentence. The gray children, the straight-jacket creatures, even the hospital itself, none of them exist just to scare. They exist to represent something the characters and the player don't want to confront. And that's the kind of writing that elevates horror. Not as spectacle, but as symbol. You can write gore, you can write violence, but what Silent Hill shows us is that pain doesn't have to be grotesque to be horrifying. Sometimes the most powerful moment in the entire game is just Lisa, crying and bleeding as she realizes the truth. There's no boss fight, no scream, just sorrow. And in that moment you feel something more intense than fear. You feel grief. Grief for a character who doesn't get a second chance. Grief for a version of yourself that knows what that kind of guilt feels like. As authors, this is where we find our edge. Horror that doesn't just jolt, but connects, that hurts, because the reader recognizes something they didn't want to admit. Another subtle lesson learned is repetition. Silent Hill's world loops. Corridors echo, maps lie, keys open new nightmares, and with every pass through a hallway you thought you'd cleared, the fear grows. This is rhythm, this is ritual, and it mimics the way real trauma works. Not as a single event, but as repetition without resolution. Writers can learn from this. Fear isn't just in the unknown. It's in the familiar made hostile. A hospital, a classroom, a child's bed. These things become terrifying not because they're evil, but because something trusted has been hollowed out. Maybe the most surprising thing Silent Hill teaches us about writing fear is this. The most terrifying stories are the ones we empathize with. We cry for Lisa. We worry for Harry. We feel for Alessa and Cheryl, even as their souls collapse into one. This isn't horror built on disconnection. It's horror built on care. And that's the real trick, because when you care about someone, their pain becomes your pain. And when you see someone endure something unbearable, not as a plot device, but as a person, that fear stays with you. Not because of what happened, but because it feels real. So what did we as writers walk away with? Let fear breathe. Let silence speak. Let metaphor carry the weight of the story. Let ambiguity open doors that clarity never could. And above all, let your readers feel complicit in the journey. Because horror isn't just about being afraid. It's about remembering the feeling long after the book is closed, the game is turned off, the last page is turned. Silent Hill lingers because it was never just trying to scare you. It was trying to show you something true, and truth hurts in ways no monster ever could. That is what it means to write fear. Not to chase screams, but to build a place where they never stop echoing. Silent Hill isn't a story you just play. It's a story that waits for you. A fog-wrapped invitation, a whisper in the dark that says, "You've got something buried, don't you? Let's dig." And you go, not because you want to be afraid, but because somewhere in that fear, you expect to find something honest. That's the real power of this game. Not its monsters or puzzles, but its willingness to wound you with truth. As a writer, I've always believed that the best stories don't offer answers. They offer mirrors. And Silent Hill 1 is one of the most effective horror stories ever told. It reflects guilt. It reflects helplessness. It reflects the kind of love that doesn't save you, but refuses to leave even when it should. And Harry's desperation, and Lisa's denial, and Alessa's endless pain, you see not just characters but echoes. And that's the kind of story that lingers. Because it's not just telling you what happened, it's asking, do you see yourself here? Years after you finish Silent Hill, you don't remember every item puzzle. You don't remember every enemy's name. You remember the fog, the silence, Lisa's tears, the way the town seemed to shift when you felt something, not when you triggered it. And if you're a writer, or even just someone who loves stories, you come away changed. Not because you learned what the town is, but because the town learned who you are. It shaped itself around your empathy, your hesitation, your quiet need to understand. And that's what horror, at its very best, does. It stops screaming and starts listening. Silent Hill isn't perfect. Its voice acting is dated, the mechanics are clunky, its visuals by today's standards are crude. But none of that matters. Because it understood story. It understood restraint. It understood metaphor. It understood the emotional weight of silence. And it had the courage to write a story that didn't try to make you feel good, just real. And that's something every writer and reader should carry into every page. Not to terrify, but to tell the truth, even when it hurts, especially if it hurts. Because real fear, the kind that makes us stop, makes us cry, makes us write, makes us read, doesn't come from the dark. It comes from the moment right before we understand what the darkness wants for us. Thank you for walking this road with me, for stepping into the fog, for listening not to me, but to the story beneath the surface. This was Silent Hill 1, a story about guilt, pain, memory, but more than anything, a story about what we do with the ghosts we carry. And if you're a writer or reader, maybe it's time to let them speak.